Thank you, Victor. And good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Very good to see you here this morning, be with you on this beautiful autumn morning. So I invite you to simply be present to your experience in this moment. I used to think of the Dharma Talk as kind of a break I could take to kick back and relax and sort of, they didn't serve popcorn at the retreats I went to, but if they did, why, I'd have popcorn and an iced tea or something, you know. But that's not the intention of the Dharma Talk. It's not the intention to go to sleep, but to continue to be present. And just to allow the teaching to come to you. And ultimately, it will reveal nothing, but it will awaken whatever you need to hear, whatever you need to be aware of. So I want to begin with this quote from the philosopher Goethe. Johann Goethe is a German philosopher, a playwright and a poet. And I want to read one of his well-known quotes, a quote I really like. He says, "As long as you don't know the meaning of this, as long as you don't know the meaning of this, die and become. Die and become. You are nothing but a dull guest on this dark earth." As long as you don't know the meaning of this, die and become. You are nothing but a dull guest on this dark earth. This really is the summary, or a summary, of virtually all mystical teachings. It's the essence of all what we might call transformational teachings. To die and become. So let's unpack what this means. I want to begin with the last phrase in his quote. He says, "You are nothing but a dull guest on this dark earth." And that may sound like criticism or sound very negative, but basically what that is after one awakens, she or he will look back at their former life and say, "I was nothing but a dull guest on this dark earth," because we see a very different earth when we awaken. The earth doesn't change, nothing changes, but our perception does, you see. We see with new eyes. That's really what transforms, is our awareness. Whenever I want to understand transformation and what it means and all of the nuances of that word, I often think of the world of nature. Nature is such a wonderful teacher for me. And particularly this time of the year reminds me of when I used to live in Western Michigan. And it was my favorite time of the year because it was pleasant, it was beautiful. The leaves would begin to turn colors, beautiful colors. But also the salmon would run from Lake Michigan. They would come up the streams, the rivers, the streams, to spawn. And I was fortunate enough to have friends that had a piece of property that had a nice salmon stream that ran up through their property. The stream itself was probably 10 feet wide, 8 feet wide, wasn't real big, fairly shallow. But the salmon would come from Lake Michigan, where they lived. Typically, they would live for 5 years, and at the end of 5 or 6 years, they would come up the streams to spawn. And after they spawned, they would die. They would travel many, many miles up streams, sometimes leaping over. You could see them leaping over small waterfall. They're beautiful fish. They're big, strong fish. They're probably 10, 15 pounds, most of them. They would come up into these tiny little streams. Sometimes the streams were just maybe 6 inches deep. It was always fascinating for me to hide behind a tree and watch them come up the stream. The fish was deeper than the water was. Sometimes they'd even lie on their side and swim sideways. And I remember one magical October afternoon, I sat behind a tree and watched what was, to me, a very sacred ritual. I saw a female salmon on her side. She was fluttering her tail, slowly waving her tail up and down and laying sideways. And what she was doing was she was waving all of the silt off the bottom of the stream until there was nothing less but a nice little gravel bed, kind of like this. No mud, no silt. And in that clean gravel bed, she would lay her eggs. And after she'd lay her eggs, she would just rest by the eggs. And then eventually a male salmon would come up the stream and would come up, and she'd move aside and he would fertilize the eggs. And he'd go back and wait a while and come up and fertilize the eggs again. Every once in a while, another male would come up. So this male would try to chase that one away, and whoever had a chance first would run up, fertilize the eggs, and come back real quickly. It was quite a dance. So this went on for several hours. The next weekend when I came back, I saw 2 dead salmon, presumably the parents. I saw the bed where the eggs were laid. You could see the eggs if you watch very closely. And the salmon, when they die, they sink to the bottom, rather than like most fish that float to the top. They sink to the bottom. And what I found out was that as the salmon die, they attract little microbes in the water that feed on the decaying flesh of the salmon, so that the salmon carcass doesn't stay there all winter long. It gets eventually eaten up by these microbes. And then when the salmon fry, the little baby salmon hatch, they feed on the microbes. They live on these microbes until they're long enough, big enough to go downstream, head out to the big lake, as we called it, Lake Michigan. And they'd live there until they were 10, 15, 20 pounds. Then they'd come back up 5 or 6 years later and do it all over again, you see. It was just such a sacred ritual to me of life, birth, rebirth, death. And it was done without any fanfare every fall. Just this natural rhythm The trees, the leaves were dying on the trees. The salmon were dying. It looked like everything was dying. But here were these fertile eggs, these little tiny salmon fry coming back to life. Life was regenerating itself. And of course, we see that in many different ways in nature, not just with the salmon, but with many plants and animals. Transformation is like that, only there's a significant difference. One significant difference is that with transformation, we find something brand new. See, nature is cyclical. It comes back. Basically, the same salmon that died are the ones that go back out to the, not the same individuals, but the same species, you see. Whereas with transformation, something new is being born, something brand new. You see. And it's interesting that in some traditions, many traditions, the salmon is a symbol of the Christ. And that's one of the things that Christianity introduced, was the idea of something brand new. In the pagan religions, prior to Christianity, prior to Judaism even, there was a connection with nature. And this connection of nature being cyclical, over and over, the same thing. So, death, rebirth, death, rebirth. And along came Christianity and this individual called the Christ, who has died and reborn, but in a very different way. He was reborn as something brand new, you see. So, transformation is a rebirth. It's part of a natural cycle that takes place throughout our lives. And yet each time there's a rebirth, there's something new. It's not just more of the same. It's not just nature doing its thing, but it's nature with intelligence arriving through it, above it, beyond it. So I'd like you sometime, actually right now would be a good time, now that I mention it, this would be a good time to just think about your own life and about the deaths and the rebirths, the transformations. You know, what has been the old life that has died, the old self that has died? What has been the renewal, that rebirth? As we look back at our lives, most all of us will see times when we've had deaths, sometimes very painful deaths. We do anything to avoid them. And yet, very often after the rebirth, we look back and we say, thank you. I realized that I was but a dull guest on this dark earth. And now I can see with new eyes. So the death and the rebirth is not an easy process, but it's a beautiful process. And it's really not optional. It's going to happen anyway. What matters is whether or not we're aware of it and we can allow it to happen and we can flow with it naturally and consciously rather than being dragged through it or pushed through it. The death is often a crisis. Crises are not easy because, number one, a crisis is a turning point. A crisis is when we have to make a decision. We come to a fork in the road. You know, we can go this way or we can go this way, but there's one direction we can't go. Which one's that? The same one we've been on, right? The old path comes to an end and it goes this way or that way, you see. That's really what a crisis is that life cannot continue as it was. And so there's a breakdown of the old, which is often, not always, but often painful, depending on how entrenched and how deep and how attached we were to the old life. And it's inevitable that we will. You know, we have spouses and children and careers and identities. And when these die, it's painful. But when we allow that death with the realization that there's a rebirth, a transformation on the other side of that, it changes our vision enough that we can welcome it, perhaps. Maybe not the first time, but after we pay attention and we notice this happens again and again in our lives, in big ways and little ways. Death and rebirth. The sun comes up again, but it's not quite the same sun. It comes up in a slightly different place. And it goes a little higher or not quite as high. It's different than the one before. If we pay attention, we're constantly dying and being reborn in so many ways. In this practice, just being aware of our thoughts. How many thoughts have been born and died since you arrived here this morning, 45 minutes ago? How many cells in your body have died and been reborn? How many breaths that's taking place constantly? And as we pay attention, when we pay close attention, we realize this is simply the nature of life itself. Whether we call it impermanence or transformation or the cycles of life. And the more that we can understand and welcome this process, then, like I say, it's not always easy. In fact, it's rarely easy. But it's less of a catastrophe, less drama. Becomes more internalized. The letting go has become a little more internal and subtle. You know, and like it says in the Tao Te Ching, you know, the wise person meets his troubles, therefore he never experiences them. In other words, we meet them with awareness. And when we do that, if we can allow the experience to occur internally, we don't necessarily have to go through all of the blood, sweat, and tears of letting go externally. You know, like so many friends of mine would say that, I look back and I see my claw marks on the ground as I was dragged into my new life. No. I don't want to go. I want to hold on to the old. And it's quite natural that we do that, but the more aware we become, the more we can live with equanimity, the less we go screaming and kicking, and the more we can realize it's part of life itself. And eventually we may even welcome the deaths. I'd like to read this poem by Brumet. I died as a mineral, and I became a plant. I died as a plant and rose to an animal. I died as an animal, and I became a human. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? When was I less by dying? Yet once more, I shall die as human, to soar with angels blessed above. And when I sacrifice my angel soul, I shall become what no mind has conceived of. So, why do we resist? Why can't we just read a book or hear a Dharma talk and say, oh, okay, I got it. We resist because it's painful, because it's frightening. Letting go of what's familiar is very anxiety-producing for most of us, because what's familiar feels safe. You know, we know our way around. We know the people. We know the landscape, so to speak. And when that goes away, it's like, how will I survive in this new world? So, and the letting go also is very painful. You know, because much of what we've lived with, we become attached to, becomes part of us. And again, that's not a bad word. You know, sometimes Buddhists think the word attachment is bad. It's quite natural, especially with members of our family and people we love. But the more attached we are, the more we suffer. It's not a punishment for being attached. It's just the way it is, almost like a law of physics. And basically, that's what the Buddha was saying. Attachment is not bad. It's not a sin. But there's a price we pay. That's all there is to it. And sometimes it's a price willing to pay. You know, I don't want to become so unattached to my children that if they were to die, I wouldn't care. No, it would tear my heart out if my children died. You say. And yet at the same time, I know I would heal from that eventually. You see. So I'd like to close with this suggestion. When you have time, I'd like you to sit down with a pad, a legal pad or something like that, and just on one side of the pad, list all of the deaths in your life. I was an embryo and I died as an embryo and I became an infant. I died as an infant and became a child. I died as a child and became an adult. So on and so forth, you see. Then on the other side of the page, write all the rebirths and see if you can connect them. And you'll see perhaps a beautiful pattern of being dying and being reborn. And who is it? What is it that dies and is reborn? You. You are that which is the string that holds the pearls together. Just like with a mala. All of the beads are the events of your life, but you are the string that holds those together, you see. And perhaps what we call physical death is when somebody cuts the string and these beads run all through the floor wherever they go. And yet we reawaken in a whole different way, you see. So that's something I'd like to offer you, and I hope you do it. So I'd like to close with this dedication that, as always, I want to dedicate our talk this morning to the benefit of all beings everywhere, and may all beings know the wisdom of living and dying consciously. Thank you for sharing your practice.